Dan? You're on, buddy.
Well, the Lord moves in mysterious ways, there's no question. I'm part of this congregation this morning. Our high school classmates of mine, and the other part is mostly family, so no pressure there this morning. What could possibly go wrong? When I started this series back, the first time I spoke in June, it's basically been the life of Abraham in the book of Genesis. The entire book of Genesis can be summed up in one word, and that's obedience. We can see time and time again through this where obedience wasn't done. I mean, people didn't do what God said they should do. Adam and Eve failed in the garden. It isn't long, and God destroys the earth with a flood. And it isn't long till from the flood to Sodom and Gomorrah, and just the lack of obedience just keeps on going. We can see the results of it are devastating. However, God calls Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldees in chapter 12 and 13. Abraham learns to walk by faith. Family issues because of Lot, his nephew. He also gets into trouble with a famine in Egypt, and everything that he picked up in Egypt causes problems. Whenever you see Egypt in the Bible, it's an analogy or it's a picture of the world. So whatever you pick up in the world is going to cause problems if you're doing it aside from the will of God. Chapter 14 and 15, we find out that Abraham is in a how to war by faith, and Lot's caused trouble and been captured by some kings from outside the area, and there's a 120-mile chase through the wilderness and a nighttime battle. That's a picture of Christ coming after us when we screw up and get way off track. You'll see that on and on and on throughout the Bible. Chapters 15 and 16, how to wait by faith, as I told you before, that's the one I'm really good at. My forthcoming book on that you'll all get a copy of, I'm sure. Autograph, no doubt, if it ever gets here. We then move on to how to work by faith. We have chapters 18 and 19 where we see that Abraham was visited by three men. He's sitting in the door of his tent, and three men show up. We find out that one of those men is the Lord, and the other are two angels. They come to visit him, and he gets everybody involved in making bread, killing the fatted calf. Everybody's involved. That's kind of a picture of how the church ought to run. Everybody ought to be involved in it. Abraham didn't do all the work. Sarah didn't do all the work. Abraham's servants didn't do all the work. They collectively waited hand and foot on these three people that showed up. But when you get to chapter 22, when you came to know Christ, you enrolled in the school of faith. You started out at elementary level and moved your own way through. That's how to walk. How to walk by faith. You get into high school and you're learning how to work by faith and war by faith. But when you get to chapter 22, you're beyond the PhD level, because this is how to worship by faith. It's a tough one for us to understand, but let's take a look at Genesis chapter 22. And this is the sacrifice of Isaac. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young man, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, son. Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went, took the ram, and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." I look at some of this and you wonder, how in the world, people are always tested, we're always tried. If we're going to be enrolled in the school of faith, those of you who are teachers know the school always has exams, right? Well, this is one of them. Job compared his trials to fire coming forth as gold. Peter picked up on the same analogy in the New Testament. Sometimes we compare them to fire or storms, sometimes warfares. But Abraham doesn't make any comparison like this. He tells his men, "Stay here, we're going to worship." Abraham saw this trial as an opportunity for worship. Now we think of worship as, we come here on Sunday morning, we start with prayer and hymns, and we start at 11 a.m. sharp and end at 12 dull sometimes. Worshiping means ascribing worth to God. It's not because of what he does, but because of who or what he is. Abraham starts with worship, but joins it with this trial, the trial of being asked to sacrifice his son. Now remember, in that day and time, that was a big deal to have an heir. Somebody to pass on your wealth to, or pass on your family name, that kind of stuff. That was a big deal. That was basically everything that Abraham had been living for was for Isaac to come. And Isaac was the promised son, right? God said this is going to happen. Instead of worshiping, sometimes what do we do? We complain, we question. Instead of worshiping, we rebel. Some people get bitter. Now I know that's none of you, but I have a couple of times. But not Abraham. The most difficult lesson we can learn in the school of faith is how to worship when we're going through the difficulties of life. Everybody here is facing something. What can we do to turn trials into worship? First point, focus on God's promises and not his explanations. We must live by God's promises, not explanations. We're always looking for an explanation. Why does this work the way it does? Why does that happen? We get an explanation, and then we want an explanation for the explanation. We have an entire Bible to go by, but I want you to understand at the time this happened, there was no Bible. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, hadn't even been written yet. So Abraham has nothing to go on other than what he hears from God out of heaven. What God had asked Abraham to do was completely unnatural. Now think about this. First of all, Abraham and Sarah are told, "You're going to have a son." And you can kind of forgive Sarah a little bit for laughing when she says, she's basically saying, "Really, at my age, you got to be kidding." Abraham's probably scratching his head a little bit. Abraham was 100 years old. Pam, you talked about your dad. Now think this through a second. Your dad, my dad, Uncle Alan, you're all having kids at almost 100 years old. I mean, it's unheard of. And Abraham's got to be scratching his head thinking, man, we are way past normal childbearing years. What in the world, God, are you doing telling us that we're going to have a kid? Obviously, we know that Abraham took the things into his own hands before that with the birth of Ishmael. We'll deal with that in a little bit. In Isaac, when Isaac was born, he was the child of promise. In Isaac were all of the promises and hope of Abraham's life wrapped up into one. How could a loving God do this? In other words, how could a loving God ask him to sacrifice his only son? We want explanations, but we don't live that way. If you keep basing everything on looking for an explanation of why this happened or why that happened, you're never going to be satisfied. Because the explanation to the explanation to the explanation is never going to fill the void in your heart. Why do good things happen to bad people? And conversely, why do bad things happen to good people? That is a tough one for me when I see some of this. But remember, God had a plan in all of this. God knew what he was doing. Stop and think back to the beginning of Abraham's life. When we first encountered Abraham in chapter 12, he was called Abram, which means exalted father. Interesting that God would call him that, given the fact that Abraham had no children at that time. When God called him out of the Ur of the Chaldees, Abraham believed when he didn't know where, but yet God took him to the land of promise. Abraham obeyed when he didn't know when. God said, I'll give you a son. It was 25 years from that time till Isaac was born. Abraham obeyed when he didn't know how. How can we have children at our age? But he trusted God. Now he has to trust God when he doesn't know why. How can a man do this? Same for us. There is no way, folks, I'm not going to lie to you, there is no possible way I ever could have done what Abraham did. But he lifted it in his trial in worship and didn't focus on the explanations. God asked Abraham to trust him. And Isaac was the heir. Now you've got to remember, Abraham and Isaac's family line is eventually going to bring somebody else of tremendous importance. Number two, when we go through this stuff, we need to focus on God's power, not our resources. The problem is we think we can handle it. God, I got this. Take the day off. Don't worry about it. Abraham had walked with God a number of years at this point. Isaac was a young man. At the time this event took place, he was not, in junior high school. This was not, a 12-year-old in the junior boys class at his church. Remember, Abraham had left home, but he had difficulty, but God saw him through it. He went through the famine and went to Egypt. We know what he picked up in Egypt caused him nothing but trouble. He had trouble with Lot, had problems with Hagar and subsequently Ishmael. If Abraham were like this, though, he'd point to his resume and say, I can handle this, I got through all of that, look at my experience. But he didn't do that, did he? As they went and built the altar, there was faith in Abraham that God could raise Isaac from the dead. Now, where in the world would Abraham have ever gotten this idea? Because up until now, there's no record in Genesis prior to the life of Abram that God had ever raised anybody from the dead. But Abraham had experienced in his own body, and Sarah's too, because they were dead, as it were. But yet, what did God do? Typical for God, does what we think is impossible. And Isaac comes along. Remember God's promises to Abraham? Now, if Abraham's thinking, how in the world is this ever going to happen? But yet God's promise to Abraham was what? Your descendants will number like the stars of the skies and the sands of the seashore. How can you count the stars for one thing, or the sand on the shore? Pretty amazing stuff, and yet God was true to his promise, wasn't he? We got to be living by what God promised, not by what our explanations are. Abraham realized that God was able to do what he had promised, and Abraham kept his eyes on what God could do through his power and not what Abraham had in resources. I think it's typical, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody here, that we think we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. I think that's somewhat typical for this country. And, it's just a mentality that, well, we got a problem here. We just suck it up and get it done, right? I think that unfortunately, at least for me anyway, I have tried to do too much of my own resources and not worry about what God promised or what he said. I got it, Lord, don't worry about it. But God is able to do as he promised. He's true to his word. I, like many Christians, am guilty of thinking small. How many of us have said, God, don't give me too much? You know how small I am. But folks, when you measure that by your yardstick and not what God says, you're always going to stay small. Stop praying for tasks that are equal to your strength and start praying for strength equal to the task. Amen. We will always stay small and be midgets. Peter, the disciple with the foot-shaped mouth. That'd be me. I have a friend of mine who's a psychiatrist, and he thinks that Peter was ADHD, and I'm not sure I can argue with that a whole lot. Yet what happened? Peter shoots his mouth off and denies Christ, lops a guy's ear off. Christ does surgery in the garden. And yet what happens with Peter? Turned to be out to be one of the greatest mouthpieces and proponents of Christianity in his day. David botched it as bad as anybody ever could have. Mm-hmm. And yet God overruled. Every king after David was compared to him. Every one of them. And they came up lacking. God even said of David, he's a man after my own heart. God took David's heart and enlarged him to bring him out. I think our tendency is that, Lord, I'm in a ticklish situation, I'm in a tough spot, and it might be of my own doing, but God, get me out of this. Well, I got a little bad news for you. God doesn't necessarily want to bring you out, he wants to bring you up. Everything that we go through in life should not be how can I get out of it, but what can I get out of it? God enlarges our trials to enlarge us, and then uses those trials for his purpose. And a lot of times I've found the things that I've been through in life, and I thought God, you're crazy, and yet it wasn't long, and I found that the experience that I had in that was also able to help somebody else going through the same thing. People are like electricity. We want the path of least resistance. Point number 3, focus on God's purposes and not our desires. Not all of our trials are from God. I mean, some of the trials that we run into are because of other people in our lives. God has his purposes for our trials. They're tailor-made for each believer. What I'm going through is not the same as what you're going through. People often blame God for trials. When Abraham went to Egypt, look at what happened. That wasn't a trial. That was stupidity on Abraham's part, foolishness. Been there, done that. When family troubles resulted from the Hagar-Ishmael situation, that wasn't a trial. That was total disobedience. When I walk in darkness apart from God and disobey and do it my way, that's not a trial. That's my own arrogance and immaturity. And the result is I reap what I sow. So stop blaming God for it. There are normal issues of life. Pam, you talked about your parents' age. My mom and dad are right there too, not far behind. In the next chapter of Abraham's life, we find that his wife dies. That's a normal part of life. And I don't necessarily look at those as trials. I mean, that's just a normal part of life, but God is still there in and through all of that. We need to distinguish between temptation and trials. Trials come from within. Temptation comes from within, but trials come from God. Temptation is the devil trying to bring out the worst in us, but trials from God are trying to bring out the best. God didn't try or test Lot. He didn't need to. Sodom did that. But what was God trying to do with Abraham as he went through this trial, as he went through sacrificing Isaac? Abraham comes out the other end of it with a deeper experience of love. Love for God and love for his son. Did he love his son? Yes, no question. But did he love his son more after that? Yes. Did he love God more? Yes. All of this was because of the trial and the troubles that Abraham went through with this. Paul says in Ephesians 3:18, and he prays that he wants us to see the length, the breadth, the height, and the depth of God's love. And I want you to think about those dimensions in Abraham's life. In chapter 13, he walked through the land. God says, walk through the length and the breadth of the land. I'm going to give this to you. In Genesis 15, Abraham is told to look at the stars. And that's the height of God's love. But Genesis chapter 22, in this situation with Isaac, he discovers the depth of God's love. Boy, do I ever need that one. Secondly, Abram had a clearer vision of Jesus. You say, wait a minute, how would Abraham know anything about Jesus? John 8:56 tells us, Jesus said, Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. And he saw it and was glad. In Isaac's birth, he saw Jesus, the promised son. Ishmael's persecution of Isaac, imagine that, two brothers not getting along. He saw Jesus, the persecuted son. In Isaac's obedience, he saw the Lord Jesus, the perfect son. In Isaac's sacrifice, he saw Jesus, the Lamb of God. Remember, the ram took Isaac's place. Jesus did the same thing for us, didn't he?
Amen.
In verse 19, Abraham returns. There's no Isaac. The next time we see Isaac, he shows up in chapter 24, where he is to take his bride, Rebekah. When Abraham sees Isaac and Rebekah together, he saw what we're looking for, that return of Jesus, because the Bible is picturing Isaac and Rebekah as Christ taking the church as a bride. And Isaac is one other thing we see. In the Bible, there are only two living sacrifices. Isaac's one of them. Who's the other? Jesus is the other. By the way, if you want to do family genealogy, I've done some on my own family, but family history and genealogy, Isaac and Jesus are related to each other. They came through the same family tree. Is it worth it? I got to imagine Abraham's thinking, what in the world is going on here? But he trusted God. Is it worth it to take your best, whatever it is you love the most, and put it on the altar? If it will give you a deeper experience of love and a clearer vision of Jesus. I would sure think so. A stronger dependence on God. Verse 14, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will see to it. The Lord will provide. Hudson Taylor, the great missionary from England to China, had it on his mantelpiece. It said Ebenezer, which means up till now the Lord has helped us. Jehovah Jireh, no matter what we're going through, the Lord will provide. He'll see to it. I hesitate to use this example, but I'm going to. At least a good many of you sitting here this morning have been through some pretty rough water in life. But the Lord will see to it coming out the other side. I can't think of a time in my life that he didn't eventually. It just wasn't on my timetable. I don't know why God doesn't see it my way. I've not figured that out yet. Thirdly, he got a greater assurance from the world. He said, I will bless, I will multiply your seed. The devil says, you won't. But God says, I have, I will, I am. Two men go up that mountain doing business with God. Abraham had built many altars, and this one had to have been the toughest. You got to remember that the altar in Abraham's life speaks of his attachment to heaven. Every place Abraham went, when God called him out of the Ur of the Chaldees, he builds an altar. He also lived in a tent. Abraham was an extremely wealthy man. He could have had the nicest tri-level in the area at that time with all the best, but he lived in a tent. Why? He's a pilgrim on a journey, and so are we. So Abraham puts Isaac on this altar. This becomes a blessing to the whole world. Because in verse 18 it says, all the nations will be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Now think about it. Who did I say came through Isaac? Jesus died on a cross. He took our place. Remember the story where Mary and Martha, in the last week of Jesus' life, Martha's making dinner and all of that. Mary brings the ointment and anoints Jesus' feet. A lot of people criticize this. It took a year's wages for her to buy that. Even the disciples criticized her. But Jesus said, her actions will be told around the world. Is that true? Sure has. Obey by faith. I don't know what is the idol on your life. I know what a lot of them are in mine. And I would classify an idol as anything that takes priority in my life over God. Anything. Some of you, I know we have to work, but some people are workaholics. That's all they work for. That's what they're living for. Some people, it's their bank account. It could be drug, sex, rock and roll. It could be all sorts of things. But what is it that you place more importance on than time with God? Now, I won't go into the list in my life because it's pretty embarrassing, but I think we have to come to the realization, I think it's foolish for us to put other things ahead of God in life and then expect Him to bless it. Lord, bless my mess. Now, if it had been me, I'd have put Ishmael on the altar and got rid of him. Nope. You don't do that. You give God your best. Remember when the shepherd, when you go out into the flock to get a sheep to sacrifice, God says you get the best one. I don't want your blind, deaf, dumb, mute, and lame. Okay? But I would have given him Ishmael, but I think that's the problem with a lot of Christians. We need to give God our best and put it on the altar. Focus on promises, not explanations. Trust God's power, not our resources. Focus on God's purposes and not our desires. A couple of examples I want to give you as I close here. J. Hudson Taylor, I've talked about him before, was an Englishman. He was walking on the sands of the shore of England, and God spoke to him and said, I want you to start a new mission agency. So he did, and it was to inland China. That work has been going on for well past 100 years because J. Hudson Taylor the first, J. Hudson Taylor the second, third, fourth, and now the fifth are still working on that ministry in that part of the world. That ministry hasn't shut down because one man said, I can play it safe and stay here in England, or I can give up what I want and I'm going to do what God tells me to. D.L. Moody, this one comes close to home in my case. You've heard of Moody Bible Institute and Moody Church in Chicago. D.L. Moody was born 30-minute drive from where my dad was born in Massachusetts. And because of his brother, he had learned how to be a cobbler. He made shoes and boots, and he was very good at what he did and was an excellent businessman. So Moody leaves central Massachusetts and ends up in Chicago. Had he not followed the call of God, and God said, I want you to go into full-time evangelism, which he eventually did, if he had not done that, there would be 2 large department stores in Chicago, not one. There would be Moody's and Marshall Field. But there's only one. Why? Because Moody, when he was called into evangelism, I'm only one guy. That's all God needs. The result is Moody Bible Institute, Moody Church. Is that still touching the world today? Sure is. Interesting story about Moody. He had in his evangelistic outreach, a young man named Billy Sunday eventually came to know the Lord. So Billy Sunday's out evangelizing. He was a semi-pro baseball player too. And a young man named Mordecai Ham comes to know Christ because of Sunday's outreach. Mordecai Ham is preaching in an evangelistic meeting in the South, and a young man from North Carolina stepped forward. Billy Graham. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association is showing a film to Korean servicemen in Korea. What happened since? My dad came to know the Lord. Comes back to Michigan. The GI Bill pays his way to go to what is now Cornerstone University. What's happened out of Dad's ministry? Last one. G. Campbell Morgan was probably one of the greatest expositors of the scripture in the Bible in the last several hundred years. He preached his first sermon at 13. He was from England. There must have been quite the revival going on in England at that time. When Hudson Taylor comes out of there, and G. Campbell Morgan, but Morgan was a great studier and a great student of the Word, great expositor, highly in demand to teach and to preach. Eventually pastored the Westminster Chapel in London for a number of years. But he was phenomenal at sermon outlines. And we would never know that this would have happened if Morgan hadn't told us about it. He was sitting in his study one night, and he had these fantastic outlines and books that he's written. And he sat there one night in his study and realized that this had become his passion. It had become an idol. It was everything, everything he was involved in. Now, I would think if you are in that great a demand and you have all this affirmation from people that you're doing a great job, but it got away from him. And he started a fire in his fireplace and burned every one of his outlines and his sermons, because he essentially said, this has gotten too much about me, and from now on it's going to be about Jesus Christ. And he burned every one of them and started over. I have one of his books on the way. I bought it off of eBay, and what little bit I've seen of it, this stuff is just like off the charts good. So here's the question I'm going to close with, a couple of them. One, what idols, first of all, do you have an altar? And if so, where is it? I'm not talking about building a barbecue out in the backyard, and I'm not talking about stealing one of the neighbor's sheep and we're going to have a burnt offering. But I'm talking about a place where you can get away from it, get away from life. For me, I go out and sit in my garage. Sometimes when I'm out doing yard work or my other stuff, I pray while I walk. I've told most of you, I work seasonally for a bunch of farmers, and so when I'm out cleaning out a manure pit, I run the pumper that pumps all that out of there. So in between loads, I get everybody rolling. I go out and start walking around and I start praying. Or I sit in the tractor and pray. Fortunately, the tractor has a good heater and good AC for the summer. But where is your altar that you're going to put this, to take it to the Lord and say, I've had enough of this. I've done it my way far too long. What's more important to you than God? That's what needs to go on the altar. God did not want Isaac's life. He wanted Abraham's heart, and he wants yours too. Marcia, what were we talking about this week? Burn it and bury the ashes. So whatever you put on that altar, when it goes up in fire, burn it and bury the ashes. Bury the alternatives. If you've made a decision to follow God and bury the alternatives and bury them deep. John, I think you probably ought to close him.